can miss, that we do a lot of work in reproductive and sexual health justice. We also work in areas of climate justice, as well as currently working with labor rights and workers' justice. So for this session, I wanted to discuss the intersections of gender rights with workers' rights, because it's something that is not always discussed in um, the sections of workers' rights and gender justice. Because what I've seen is that in many spaces, we look at how women and in many ways girls are affected by the demands of labor. And this is not to say that girls supposed to be into these spaces at their ages, but there are dynamics in place that are forcing girls to work. So I wanted to break this down into three aspects: how this impacts women, how this impacts girls, and the occupational safety and health legislation that should be in place to mitigate and seize these effects. So for women, it is something that is very dire. Worker injustices and disparities have impacted women for decades, and this can be based on factors such as sexual harassment. We have seen many ways that women are forced to engage in certain unwanted acts or are just simply harassed on a daily basis. Um, there are ways that they are actually fighting for legislation to stop sexual harassment, which should have been done a very long time ago. In other ways as well, we've seen a lot of conversations and arguments on pay disparities, for women in many fields, and especially with the intersections of race, they would be paid significantly lesser than their male counterparts. And oftentimes they may be doing the same jobs, and more often than not, they're doing more than, and they are still paid less. So these are significantly targeted and intentional acts that are placing women at risk for disenfranchisement, because now they have to, even though they're catching up, they are still being treated less. And these are very much concerns in terms of how we approach workers' rights, because we want workers' rights and gender justice to be connected thoroughly, and we want to understand how can gender justice be included in the conversations with workers' rights. So when we look at, for example, in the Caribbean, and more specifically in countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, there is occupational safety and health legislation. However, it is not it's not something that is very detailed. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of details in that, but there should be more specifics, because one of the key striking factors is that it always reinforces so far as reasonably practicable. And that can give a lot of wiggle room for employers and management to enact certain policies against creating safer spaces for women, but not necessarily enough to protect them fully, right? So in many spaces, women have to perform certain tasks that are filled with numerous hazardous, practices and risks, and they are working in these spaces for their livelihoods, right? We cannot deny the realities that many of these women are doing this not only to survive for themselves, but to care for their families, to care for the environment, to care for their communities in any way that they can. And oftentimes the employer knows this. So for a lot of women who are facing gender disparities at work, they are disadvantaged because the employer knows that they're doing this to live, yet they also expect them to tolerate these systems because they know they have to live. And they don't want to sacrifice their lives or their livelihoods. So many of them are forced to do it. And that should be of immediate concern, because then it questions what are employers, what are policymakers, what are authorities putting in place to ensure that women are protected, right? And now we can go a deep dive into how this impacts girls, because again, this should not be a scenario where girls should have to work in such a capitalist system, because this is a very much capitalist and exploitative system. Girls should be able to center their lives around activities that are age appropriate and doesn't require them to enter this type of workforce. However, the reality is that it's happening. It's happening in many countries, and they are also in many instances doing this for their families, doing this because they're in situations where they have to provide support, which shouldn't be the case. But this is heavily backed upon the system of exploitation, because if their parents or their caregivers or other members cannot adequately provide, then they are going to be forced to assist in certain ways, and that should not be the case. So what's happening there is that the system is also intentionally targeting girls to perform duties related to work, and not schoolwork, because I mean, it should be a case where they are afforded accessibility to education and leisure and other activities, for their girlhood, or however they may see fit, but it's geared towards them having to work. And these factors now, it has to be considered in legislation, because girls and women are both in very multifaceted ways affected by labor, affected by worker injustices, and must be considered in policies and legislation that I believe aren't adequately, factored in the conversation of gender justice. What is very striking is that even before we can talk about policies and legislation, we have to question if these things exist everywhere, because there are many places that occupational safety and health legislation does not exist. So you do not have a worker representative, a safety representative in your establishment. You may not have, a union. You may not have certain principles and policies in place that says, hey, we need to consider how our work practices and our work environments are protecting women, but we also need to consider that we should not have girls entering these workforces and having to endure these effects either. So what I wanted to recommend in this instance is that with a lot of the conversations that we have on gender justice, we factor in workers' rights. And it can start very simple, because people are, as I said, are doing it. They are discussing factors of sexual harassment. They are discussing factors of pay gaps. They are discussing factors of racial objectification. They are exposing the ways that women are affected in the workforce, but it's supposed to reach stages that it's more defined than that. We can still have those factors in, but let it be something that is more holistic, because women and girls are impacted by in many more ways. We can allow for these spaces to also involve how other identities are affected in the process, because as the previous speaker mentioned, there are systems in place against trans persons. Similarly, there are systems in place for persons with disabilities. There are systems in place for migrants. There are systems in place for different identities that are very much interconnected with the aspects of gender. And what needs to happen now is that we consider all of those and just group them together and say, you know what? This is so interconnected into labor justice, because for many of us, we are going to always have to work. And I, to an extent, consider this as an unfortunate case, because I do not think that our lives should be centered around our profitability in that way. I think it should be centered around other things, because we are more than our labor. We are more than the work that we provide in the context of the capitalist system. I do believe that we can include work, but in a more meaningful and communal way that is equitable and that allows for growth within our communities, rather than economic growth for a very small percentage of society that will always reap the financial benefits at our expense. And when we detach ourselves from the current system of work, then we can adapt and adopt to principles that are inclusive for girls and women, that are protecting girls and women, and that are allowing us to exist in spaces that are actually safer for us. And in doing so, we can have a better approach to gender justice, because we need it to be something that is more holistic for us, rather than just allowing things to continue. And yeah, there are small strides along the way, but at the end of the day, employers and management are always going to do what's necessary for them to ensure that their assets are in order, their financial assets are in order, and they won't always consider how their working conditions, the current policies are affecting girls and women. So I think that is what I wanted to really touch on today because I think it's something that is very important. I think it's something that for all of us in the work that we do, in whatever work that we do, we can look at it and say, hey, how is this affecting work? Because when we have to work every day, for many of us who have to work every day in certain spaces, we are facing more exposure in that space than we be facing at home. Many of us are working for several hours a day to a week um, in very hazardous conditions. And we are not getting as much exposure to any other part of our lives because we are working. So, in a sense, approaching gender justice should mean that to understand that work is a significant factor because work for many of us is inescapable because we need to live. And until there are more principles in place that can allow us to have more meaning of ourselves, more activities outside the realm of exploitative practices with regards to work and the ability to decenter work, we need to factor in how work, the system that exists with work is taking such a hold on our lives. And there are there are many risks involved with the practices of work in its current state. And that should be very considerable factors in terms of how we approach gender justice to be more inclusive, to be more holistic, and to really consider that girls and women are still continually affected by harmful working practices. So that's just what I want to to share for today. I don't know if anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to share based on their experiences with work. I am very much open to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really was waiting for this session, and I am really, really happy that we didn't have no breakouts. So we have 15 seconds remaining. You guys can join the link and the chat, and then if you have the chance to ask Princess a question. Okay, guys, can you please